Hello again. This is Amfortas with part 2 of a podcast entitled The Justification for the New Stolen Generation. In this part, I will look at some of the guiding principles advocated in the Bible of the Family Court, the 1973 book, The Best Interests of the Child, the Least Detrimental Alternative. It also guides the Family Court's multitude of professional hangers-on, the rent-seeking scum described in Part 1. I will show the detrimental effects of seeking the least detrimental alternative. In the introduction to the paperback edition, it says, "There is little consensus in law or science about what best interest means. In the absence of a clarifying definition, personal preferences of lawyers, judges and social workers may govern decision-making. And when two adults compete for a child's custody, best interests of the child can easily be subverted by being equated with the best interests of the more deserving adult. And subverted it easily is, by lawyers and judges, and particularly social workers, who do exercise personal preference. There are doubtless many amongst us who are well familiar with this effect, as the family law makes it clear that it is a competition, and the most deserving parent is established on the basis of genitalia, and that deserving supported by a biased professional machinery. Other potential and real failures of the system are introduced. For example, it says, failure to recognize and respect cultural differences in the way parents interact with their children may result in removal of children from their parents based on a state agency's culture-bound perception of abuse. Indeed, but I would take it further. Gender differences are not even mentioned, in line with the then developing feminist theory that men and women were the same. It underpins the family court view that a father is redundant, and that a child can do without a father altogether, as it will get all it needs from the mother. Also, state agencies have their own culture, which is quite different from day-to-day life, as any taxpayer knows. How real is the life reflected by the tax form manual? Do we really expect the courts to be any different, rule-bound and prejudiced as it is? It is prejudice in the sense of prejudgment, in the expectation that everyone who walks in the door must fit some predefined mould or template. Roles are allocated, and the main mould used is gender. The book's introduction includes a number of points of advocacy which serve to warn against the very obvious biases that can creep into the system, biases which have subsequently crept in with a roar of welcome by the practitioners. Bias even makes its way into the introduction's own wording. The interests of the child, the introduction says, are to be considered separate and apart from the interests of her family, as a unit, only if and when family fails to provide care according to minimal cultural standards. Notice that. A Freudian slip, perhaps? The authors refer to the generic child as her. As far as I can tell, they continue to use only the female gender for this purpose throughout the book. There are no his or him other than in specific cases. Elsewhere in English, where the male word is used to include the female, an age-old lexical convention, it is deemed sexist, not PC. But not the other way round, of course. By sticking to she and her throughout their book, the authors set a tone which does injustice to fully half of their intended words. What are we to conclude? Are the authors pandering to a prejudiced audience, or are they subtly teaching them? Another potential failure is flagged. Once the family ceases to function adequately for a child, it says, if the child is abused or abandoned, or when separating parents cannot agree on custody, the state should intervene. This is interesting. Parents arguing over custody are, in this sense, automatically lumped together with neglectful and abusive parents. Parents are quite capable of having alternative views on custody while not neglecting nor abusing their children. The precision of language is important here, and this already exposes an assumption that goes unquestioned. It is the thin edge of just one of many wedges. Is it not possible to establish laws which require intervention only if there is neglect or abuse? What if there was a default position of joint and equal custody and access, and to interfere with that, or fail to step up to one's responsibilities, should be considered as abuse or neglect? That, I suggest, would be a far better approach. Mendacious and vilifying argument against joint custody is one of those issues at the torrid end of feminist vituperation. Another issue raised in the book. Once the state intervenes, it must put the child's interests first, the authors say, over and above that of even the most deserving of adults. Placement of a child, they say, must never be used to compensate an adult who has suffered misfortune or injury or injustice at the hands of another adult or the state. Otherwise, respect for the blood tie can only too easily be turned against the child's interests. The authors seem appropriately concerned that the child placement should not be used as compensation, but they don't say anything against punishment for a parent. Blood tie is of no consequence. It matters little to them. The child is not the parent's child once she or he reaches a court, it implies. It is already a ward of the state. A juggernaut can and is driven through these gaps. All other areas of law, all people are considered equal before the law. Classes of people are not to be considered. Men, women, rich, poor, they are all to be treated equally. The landowner and the peasant have been treated as equal before the law since Magna Carta. Not in the family law, though. A superior class has been created. Children. Now, who's going to argue with that? Adolf Hitler knew the answer. No one, if you tell them that it's in the best interests of the children. And especially if the children are given over to the mother, who becomes dependent on the state. Well, I do. I argue with it, and invite you to as well. It is advocated that the placement should be unconditional. Later on in the book, the authors argued that the court should not even assign visitation to a non-custodial parent. It seems that the custodial parent's attitudes, motivations and actions are to be considered above reproach. There is no suggestion that obstructing the child's relationship with a non-custodial parent or undermining his or her parental authority is to be considered abuse or neglect. The sole custody model is first stage parental alienation. Parental alienation is child abuse. It follows that sole custody model is child abuse too. This 1973 book was written well ahead of data gathered over the subsequent 40 years, which show the effects of the application of the book's guidelines. Fathers have been driven from the family and from children's lives. A culture of fatherless families has become the norm. Fatherless families outnumber families with fathers. Single parenting is common and increasing. This is largely single mothers enthralled to state support and control. Men and fathers are marginalised at best and vilified in public policy. Children without fathers have increased problems and risk in all major aspects of their lives. Remember the best interests of the children and saving them from abuse, neglect and abandonment? Family courts create precisely the single-parent homes in which actual abuse and neglect is more likely to occur. Fathers are forced from their children's lives, and the public is told that they have abandoned them. According to the United States Department of Health and Human Services, children of single parents had a 77% greater risk of being harmed by physical abuse. By whom, you might ask? They have an 87% greater risk of being harmed by physical neglect and an 80% greater risk of suffering serious injury or harm from abuse or neglect than children living with both parents. Again, who is the parent inflicting these serious injuries, abuses and neglect? The father isn't there. He's been driven out. Britain's Family Education Trust reports that children are up to 33 times more likely to be abused in a single-parent home than in an intact family. Again, the father is not the one doing it. He has been dispossessed. The educational achievement of single-parent children is lower. Drug use is far higher. Pregnancy in teen years is far higher. Delinquency is higher. Most prisoners in our jails are from single-mother homes. The ills to society mount. A stolen and abused generation, justified by 1970s Marxist ideology. I finish here. Thank you for listening, and please ask your friends to listen too. Send them a link. I thank my producer and friend, the men's rights activist Christian J., for his technical and distribution assistance. And I also acknowledge the Father's Rights blogger, Just Another Disenfranchised Father, for the theme and some points. I dedicate this podcast to my estranged daughter, who I miss so very, very much, and my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased. Written and spoken by Amfortas. Ask, who does the Grail serve?